Good afternoon, Alonzo. Thanks for joining us. We're going to wait for a few others to join us, and we'll get started here shortly. Okay, Channery, did you want to wait a couple more minutes, or did you want to get started here in the next minute or so? It looks like Christine's going to join us.
Let's wait a couple more minutes because we still have some other planning team members that accepted, but maybe just give them another minute or two to join us.
Sounds great. Hey, Christine, thanks for joining us. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. I think we have some people who are running late to the meeting, so we're just going to get started here in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, as was I. But I'm gonna try to make this work. I'm on a different place today, so I'm just glad to be on.
Absolutely. No, thanks for joining us. No worries.
Yeah, glad to have you. Thanks, Christine.
Uh-huh.
Looks like we got an email from a Michelle Channery, so I'm going to send her the Zoom invite. Looks like she's going to join. I think once Michelle joins Channery, we could probably get started.
Yeah, I know we have a lot to cover.
Yeah. Thanks, Jacqueline, for joining us. We're going to get started here in the next few minutes. We're going to wait for one more member to join us, and we'll get started here shortly. Michelle, thanks for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with our meeting today. Thank you all for joining us for our third planning team meeting for the Fort Sam Houston Regional Center. Just for the presentation, kind of general guidelines, just please allow us to go through the presentation. We're going to go over some exciting topics today. But in the meantime, certainly feel free to utilize the chat feature or even the reaction button. We can always, we have some staff members on hand who can look through the chat, answer any questions you may have during the duration of the presentation. But thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate your efforts in joining this planning team meeting. Next slide, please. So to overview our planning team, project team, we have myself, David, as a co-project manager, along with Ms. Channery Gould, who's on this call, who is co-project manager as well. We have our MIG team, which includes Jay Rankins, who is not on this call today, as well as Andrew Roots, but we do have Kristen Ramirez, who's on the call today, Ellie Schaefer, Sal Vasquez, who's not also on the call today, but we have Farah, who's on the call with us as well. And then we have Miss Chris Cox, who's a principal planner with Mosaic with us today.
Recording in progress.
Next slide, please. So some of the objectives today that we'll be overviewing is the review of our vision and goals. So we'll kind of go over some of the comments we received at the last meeting, as well as kind of a review of some of the vision and goals that were established at the time from the community input that we received from the community-wide survey, as well as the community meeting that we hosted several months ago. And also review, Channery's going to review some drafted focus areas based on some comments that we received at the last planning team meeting. Kristen's going to review housing and job projections for the area. And then we're going to have Carissa, who's going to cover land use, as well as a drafted land use base map. And then we'll have Ellie Schaefer with MIG covering an overview of land use categories. And then we'll have a fun focus area land use activity thereafter. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And so in the review of our drafted vision, for the vision, we really received well-rounded comments, positive feedback from the planning team at the last meeting. Really the only comment that we received was just less connotation as it relates to the protection of the military base AT&T Center by our employee areas as it relates to integrated land use. So we've kind of replaced that word protection from that original language in the vision statement with well integrated. So essentially it's just going to read: the Fort Sam Houston Area Regional Center is a high quality place to live, work, learn, trade, and play with safe and distinct neighborhoods connected to and are well integrated with the military base in AT&T Center and vibrant employment areas, essentially just adding kind of more positive connotation to it. Next slide, please. And then our drafted goals, we received really well received feedback for this, more so positive feedback for some of the drafted goals and vision statement that we have. And again, these are drafted vision statement and goals. So up until adoption, these are purely drafted. So if we need to make any adaptations or any adjustments throughout the planning process, we can certainly do so, as well as to receive feedback even today during our land use activity. We could always provide or are welcome to your feedback regarding these. So these are always fluid and adaptable throughout the planning process. Next slide, please. And I will say, as we go into the drafted focus areas, which Channery is going to cover, as well as the land use activity, do please keep in mind some of the vision statement and the goals. That's going to be really essentially the backbone to how we plan the Fort Sam Houston area throughout this planning process. So definitely keep in mind some of the goals that we have established through community input, even the input that you have provided towards the vision and goals going into these activities and these focus areas. So I'm going to transition to Ms. Channery, who's going to cover some of the focus areas for the Fort Sam area.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. So during our last planning team meeting, we talked about focus areas, and in essence, the definition for the focus areas is any areas of opportunity to direct future investment, support, or improvements. And that could be captured in a variety of ways. So we thought it would be helpful to show you two examples from another community area plan that's further along in the planning process. Next slide, please. So this example is of the Hackberry Street corridor, which is from the draft Southeast plan. And that community area plan is scheduled to go to City Council in a couple months. And the vision for Hackberry Street corridor is to have a revitalized corridor with more businesses along Hackberry and creating a walkable environment. Next slide, please. You can see the rendering captures the vision with improved sidewalks, reduced driveway curb cuts, and street trees are added to make it more pedestrian friendly. So we wanted to show this to you so that you can think about this as an example as we discuss corridors for the Fort Sam Houston area. Next slide, please. This is another example from the draft Southeast plan. One of the focus areas included in the Southeast Community Area Plan was an area with vacant land and underutilized sites, which we had presented to the exhibit that Matt Prosser with EPS had conducted an analysis on for the Fort Sam Houston area. So we took the same approach with the Southeast Community Area Plan. And so what you'll see here, the existing conditions, it shows there's a vacant parcel there and then some areas surrounding it off Roland Road that were identified as underutilized parcels. Next slide, please. And the vision for this focus area was for a mix of neighborhood scaled commercial and medium density residential uses that incorporate some ground floor retail, dining, and grocery. Some small outdoor gathering spaces were also mentioned as being important. And so this vision for this area accommodates more housing in the Southeast Community Area Plan while also creating a new amenity for the community. Next slide, please. So based on the feedback that we had received from the planning team during the last meeting, and then also based on input that we received during the community meeting, and then also a survey, this is the preliminary focus area exhibit that identifies areas that we had discussed during the last meeting. And the next few slides will talk about each focus area, or I'll just give some quick highlights. And then we'll have plenty of time for the planning team to provide input and discuss each one in more detail when we start the land use activity and pull up the mural board to take notes to capture your comments. Next slide, please. So the first focus area is the AT&T Parkway corridor. And this was based on input from our last planning team meeting, and then also comments received during the community meeting, and then also the survey with the AT&T Center nearby, and comments that we received related to a desire to improve traffic flow, congestion, and also improve other modes of commuting along AT&T Center Parkway. This would be a good corridor that we can highlight in the Fort Sam Houston area plan. Next slide, please. Focus area number 2. This was also based on our discussion during the last planning team meeting. This is the northern portion of AT&T Center Parkway, and then also the industrial park area north of I-35. Next slide, please. Focus area number 3 is the East Houston Street corridor. And this was identified as an appropriate corridor because of VIA's advanced rapid transit line along Houston Street. And this would also serve as a continuation of the Houston Street corridor, which was also identified as a focus area in the draft East Side Community Area Plan, which is further along in the planning process. Next slide, please. Focus area number 4. This was identified during our last planning team meeting. One of our planning team members, I believe it was Mr. Jones, had suggested opportunities for identifying where housing could go, and the vacant site behind the Res Care Community Living Facility off Belgium was mentioned. So we have this highlighted, and within this focus area, we included that living facility, and just wanted to point out that that's not to indicate that we're looking to replace it or anything. It's more so to be able to mention the importance of compatibility of uses within this focus area. And that can be achieved with certain design features, such as extending sidewalks, contemplating appropriate building layout, and so forth. Next slide, please. Focus area number 5 is Salado Greenway, and this was mentioned, and we also discussed this during our last planning team meeting. We also received comments during the community meeting and through the survey expressing an interest in enhancing this greenway as an opportunity for trail connectivity. And just want to mention, while we are identifying it here as a focus area, it might be something that we might think is best to fold into the amenities and public space section of the plan instead of identifying it as a focus area, but we can make that determination as we progress in the planning process. Next slide, please. Focus area number 6 is W.W. White Road Corridor. This is based on evaluation of how busy it is along this roadway and all the different businesses ranging from a lumber yard, other industrial use types that exist there, commercial, and there's even some fast food drive-through establishments along both sides of W.W. White. So it seemed appropriate for us to discuss with the planning team. Next slide, please. Focus area number 7 is Loop 410 and IH10. I believe this was mentioned during our last planning team meeting, but we wanted to revisit this because you'll see that we have a total of 12 focus areas. And as we were looking at this and evaluating it in comparison to some of the other focus areas, we're not really sure if this is one that seems appropriate as a focus area, perhaps because that clover leaf area, that's TxDOT right of way. So our ability to do anything within that interchange area is somewhat limited. There's currently a plat being processed for continued industrial use there. And we thought we'd discuss this with the planning team to see if it's a viable site for any other uses beyond industrial, because right now it's all predominantly light industrial use. Next slide, please. Focus area number 8 is the Ackerman Road Corridor, and this was based on our discussion from the last planning team meeting. We were hearing from planning teams comments about how busy Ackerman Road is. I believe there were some comments during the community meeting also about how busy it gets because of the industrial uses along both sides. And then we had mentioned during the last planning team meeting, and you can't see it on the aerial here, but just west of Ackerman Road along that vacant area, north of Diedrich Road, there's a plat being processed for industrial use along that vacant parcel of land. Next slide, please. Focus area number 9 is IH35 and Loop 410 intersect. This area is a light industrial use area. However, I believe when we were talking about it, because of its proximity to BAMC and having the freeway overpass as a connection point to BAMC, we thought we can discuss with the planning team what other uses you think could be suitable and appropriate here. Next slide, please. Focus area number 10. This vacant parcel was identified on the vacant and underutilized parcel analysis map that Matt Prosser with EPS had presented during the last planning team meeting. There's some nearby residential subdivisions along with distribution centers off of Rittiman Road. And on the other side of the rail line past the study boundary of this plan area, there's also some distribution centers. And thought it'd be helpful to point out to the planning team that the site is east of a floodplain area, but the good thing is it is not within the 100-year floodplain. So this would be a great focus area for us to identify potential uses that the planning team envisions. Next slide, please. Focus area number 11 is near Wilshire Park. And this is off Rittiman Road, just east of Salado Creek. There's an existing Thai house restaurant. And I'd like to mention that that's actually one of my favorite Thai restaurants in this area. They have the best papaya salad. Don't get medium spice unless you're able to handle a lot of spice, because their medium spice is very spicy. But behind the Thai restaurant there and some of the other commercial establishments there, there's a large parcel that was identified as an underutilized site. And this is right next to the Hallbrook Road underpass that runs along the length of Salado Creek. So again, we think that this could be a good and viable focus area site. And the last focus area, next slide, please. The last focus area, number 12, is Bellmead. This triangular portion here is the eastern corner of the Bellmead neighborhood located west of Fort Sam. Right now, there's an existing apartment complex there, a restaurant and a gas station. And we thought it'd be helpful to discuss this area with the planning team as well, because it seemed like a good location based on the intersection and then adjacency to an established neighborhood. But again, I know I went over those very quickly. We'll have a chance to visit each focus area when we discuss, when we go through the land use activity and pull up the mural board so that we can take notes as we receive your input. Now with that, Kristen will discuss housing and jobs projections. Thank you.
Thank you, Channery, and thank you for somehow you went through all 12 focus areas very quickly and thoroughly. So good job on that. So we wanted to kind of tee up our land use conversation by giving some housing and job projections. Really all of our regional centers are meant to capture a lot of the growth that we're going to see out into the 2040 spectrum. That's really when our comprehensive plan is projected to. And so Fort Sam area, obviously being a regional center, is part of those areas meant to capture a lot of the growth and development that it will be occurring within our future, and also that is already occurring. So on this next slide, I just wanted to give you some, again, some kind of data going into our land use conversation. And so you'd have this really at your fingertips and be able to utilize this amongst the vision and goals. And then obviously even our focus areas that we just presented, and utilize that as you're walking through our land use discussion later on. And so you can see that, again, 50% of the jobs within Bexar County are already located within these regional centers. And again, a lot of the commercial industrial space are within regional centers themselves. So it's no surprise that the Fort Sam Houston area is meant to have, by 2040, it's projected to have almost 23,000 new jobs. So that's, again, starting from the 2010 mark, but still we're only a third of the way through that chapter. And so we're still anticipating a lot of growth of new jobs in that area, in this area. And then obviously to complement that, we will have a lot of housing growth that will come with this as well. So on this next slide, you'll see that we are looking at capturing almost 2,000 new housing units per year for the entire 2040 projection. So that's about 60 new units per year. And so it's not as high as other areas within the city, but that is just given the nature of this regional center, obviously knowing that the military base is a big part of this regional center, and then many industrial areas also are. And so the residences will complement that. But again, it's very different than, let's say, the Stone Oak Regional Center, where they have a much higher projection of household growth. So again, just wanted to kind of keep that back of mind as we're talking through our land use items. In this next section, we'll be kicking that off shortly. And just wanted to let you know that we will be taking a much deeper dive into housing and jobs, economic development data and projections in our upcoming meeting. So this won't be the last time you get this information, and we'll continue to build on that in our next meeting. So I'll pass this on to Carissa now to kick us off with our land use discussion.
Thanks, Kristen. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay,
Yes.
thanks. I'm Carissa. I'm president of Mosaic Planning and Development Services, and I'm a consultant on MIG's team focusing on land use. And so this is my first planning team meeting. I haven't met everybody before, so it's nice to get to visit with everybody. This is going to be a more interactive meeting towards the end. We're going to give you a little bit of information up front, and then we need some feedback from you about there's some land use questions we need some feedback from. So let's go ahead and jump in to the next slide. I believe you guys hit on some of this at your last planning team meeting very briefly, but when we talk about land use, for this plan, for the purposes of this plan, we're not going to get down into super specifics. The land use plan deals with general categories being residential, which is where people live, commercial, which is where we shop and eat and have our offices. Industrial properties are where things are manufactured or distributed or mined, extracted from the ground. And then there's parks and open spaces and government uses. Those are the general categories of land use that we'll be dealing with for this plan. And then each of those categories will be broken out more specifically based on intensity of use. Next slide. Land use regulations have been around for thousands of years. Back in the day, architects would design cities. They still do in some parts of the world. But here in the United States, about 100 years ago, the Zoning Enabling Act was passed, and that was the beginning of land use regulation in our country. Most cities in the country have some type of land use plan in place, and that's because land use is used by cities to protect the health, safety, and welfare of communities. The land use plan also allows cities to manage traffic congestion and to promote public safety and prevent the overcrowding of land. Overcrowding is not the same thing as density. The idea is we need to be able to manage future growth to keep our cities safe and to maintain an adequate quality of life for the people who live and work here. There's two different ways you'll hear people talk about land use. There's existing land use, which is what's on the ground right now, and then future land use. Before COVID, our team did a survey of existing conditions, and I believe that David or Chan can provide you access to a document called the Existing Conditions Atlas for this plan area, for the Fort Sam Regional Center plan. And that just documents existing conditions in place today. And that was our baseline. We started by looking at that, and that's already been done. So for the rest of this presentation today and moving forward, our focus will be on future land use. And that's just how land can be used in the future. Next slide. So we're not talking about zoning today. I mean, you'll hear me mention it because the two are so closely related, but I wanted to take a little bit of time to differentiate between the two so everyone's very clear. When we're talking about zoning, zoning is applied to individual properties, and zoning is about regulation. So the city's zoning code or zoning ordinance is a set of regulations that define the particular rights of use for an individual property. So every property in the city, for the most part, is zoned. And the zoning for that property tells you the types of uses that can be exercised on that property, and then any of the spatial constraints like building heights or setbacks that type of development has to comply with. And so the zoning is a definition of rights of use for a property owner for their property, and that's what zoning does. So it focuses on the rights of use for individual properties. The land use plan, in contrast to that, is not individual property focused. It's focused on areas. It's about relationships and patterns among properties in an area. The land use plan is a policy document, so it's going to provide parameters for development and growth. So it's a decision-making tool that's used by elected officials, staff, and other agencies to make decisions about development. So the land use plan is a policy document. The zoning ordinance is regulations. The land use plan is area-wide. It's going to focus on relationships and patterns, whereas the zoning code, the zoning regulations apply to individual properties. So we're going to be looking at things at a higher, more general scale in the land use plan than you would be in the zoning code. So the maps aren't going to look the same, and it can't. You know, we're not pre-zoning anybody. We're just looking at land use at a higher, more general scale with this plan than we would be with the zoning map. Okay, next slide. And so because of that, everyone, you know, once you put a map up, everyone gets worried. They'll see red and yellow and gray and blue and want to know how that affects their property. So this is just to be very clear that the future land use plan does not automatically change the zoning of any property. So you still retain rights of existing rights of use. Every property will retain those existing rights of use. So that means that if you have a doggy daycare center and let's say the future land use plan shows your property being, I don't know, mixed use or something like that, it doesn't, or industrial, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you can't run your doggy daycare center. It just means if you sell your property and somebody wants to come in and rezone it in the future, then they have to comply with the plan for growth for that area. So the land use plan doesn't take away anybody's rights to their existing use. It doesn't change the zoning of anything, and it doesn't cause any buildings to be removed or anything like that. The land use plan guides decisions about future uses if those uses are going to change. It's also a guide to put in place where if there are areas of major conflict, how those conflicts can be resolved. So in that sense, the future land use plan does define how a property can be rezoned in the future. It sets guides for elected officials when they have to decide rezoning cases. So if someone comes forward and proposes a property rezoning, the land use plan is the decision-making tool to indicate to council and the commissions and staff whether that's an appropriate rezoning or not. The land use plan, that third bullet is, the third and fourth bullet is also very important, that when the land use plan is developed, one of the things we look at is whether or not it's going to be able to accommodate the projected growth in an orderly fashion. So those numbers that Kristen just read to you about projected employment growth and projected housing growth, we want to make sure that this new land use plan is able to accommodate those numbers. So when we go through over the next few planning team meetings and we talk about where certain things should go and levels of intensity of development and things like that, keep in mind part of the objective of this is to meet those targets. So we've got to be able to absorb the anticipated growth in a way that is orderly and that is manageable and that preserves quality of life and quality of development. It's also going to establish communities' preferences for mixtures of uses and distribution of density. So there's going to be certain areas, certain parts of this plan area that can accommodate higher intensity uses, and there will be other parts of the plan area that really can't. So that's part of our discussions. We'll be talking with you about that. Can this go here? Is it appropriate here? Where can this go? That's part of what gets resolved by this planning effort as well. Okay, next slide. We're going to stop for questions in a minute, I promise. And we already mentioned this, but just so you know, in the middle of this slide is a picture of a future land use map for another plan area. This is not the Fort Sam Regional Center area. This is the area around Brooks, down on the south of y'all, around 410 and excuse me, 37. And this plan was adopted a few years ago, but we just wanted to show you an example of a land use plan once it gets finished. You'll notice that all of the colors are kind of in larger, more general blocks. It's not as polka dotted as a typical zoning map would be. And again, that's because we are looking at land use trends and relationships over larger areas. We want corridors to have some continuity, centers to be defined, things like that. So a land use plan, you'll get one for this area that will have the same color assignments and the same principles of how the map will be allocated or laid out, but it will be customized to your area based on some of those issues I just brought up. And council uses these maps, obviously, to make decisions about rezoning. Your planning commission and zoning commission also reference these documents, as well as city staff and partner agencies such as VIA and TxDOT and people like that. The land use plan is also a pretty helpful tool for private developers and property owners. Because it's a guide, a decision-making guide, it's a good indicator of the city's kind of interest in or threshold of tolerance for certain types of new development and redevelopment. So when people are doing their due diligence, they can look at this map to see whether their project would be considered suitable for an area they're looking at. And so land use plans are really helpful for the development community as well in that regard. Next slide. So on the bottom left is, again, that sample map from another area, so you can kind of have a picture of that. And in the middle, the map is keyed out to the city's land use categories. About 4-ish years ago, the city adopted a new set of land use categories. And up until this time, San Antonio's had a lot of land use plans in place throughout the city that have been passed over the last 50, 60 years or even more in some cases. However, every single small neighborhood plan was done completely separate, almost in a vacuum. And so there's no uniformity in what categories were used, how they're defined, and how they're applied. So it was very difficult to implement and to promote any type of continuity throughout the city in regard to how corridors are treated, how these regional centers are treated, what types of parameters and restrictions are going to be placed on development, because there was no uniformity in approach. And so this effort we're going through right now is in large part trying to rectify that. So we have a uniform set of categories that are applicable across the whole city, and every single part of the city is going through this exact same exercise. And so whereas in the past, like some of the historic neighborhoods and areas where you have a lot of community involvement and they pushed for plans in the past, those areas had really good neighborhood plans in place, but then a lot of areas of town didn't have any. And so there's some challenges as far as equity is concerned there, obviously, but also because there's not uniform application, you just don't know if there's a principle of fairness in that either. So by having the same categories applied citywide and having every part of the city undergo this process, you're ensured of a citywide land use plan that is much easier for staff and officials to implement and more predictable to in terms of how it'll be developed and realized. So those categories are listed in the middle. It's very small font. I apologize. I have terrible eyes. I can barely read things on the screen. But these are the same categories you should have gotten in your packets. Before I continue, just to, I know we're all familiar with Zoom meetings, but just a reminder, our group's not huge, but there are more than a few of us on this call, and the presentation's kind of long. So while we're going through, if you have any questions or comments, and when we go to ask questions, just a reminder to use your raise your hand feature. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, the tab that says reactions, if you click on that, there's an option for raise hand. So if you do have any questions or comments and either I didn't hear you or you just want to jump in and do that, feel free to use that button. As we're going forward talking about all this. But my question for y'all is, did everybody receive the land use categories? I think were they emails to everybody or mails? Emails? Okay. So we're going to get into the districts more specifically later, but just as I'm talking, oh, okay. So we have one that says they haven't received them.
I'll email you.
So, okay, perfect. So as I'm talking in preparation for our next kind of step in all of this, you may want to get those categories out and have them accessible. If you've printed them, have them out next to you wherever you are. If you just have them on your monitor, just have a way to get to those, because they're pretty information dense, and it's just hard to keep all of these different categories straight. We're going to do our best today to give you some tips for how to differentiate among the categories, but this next 30-ish minutes of this is going to be a chance for you to familiarize yourself with those categories. For every single one of the land use categories, there is a description of what types of uses would be appropriate. On the screen right here is an example. So I just pulled up low density residential as an example of what these categories would tell you. So you notice the first paragraph describes the types of uses that you would find in an area on the map that is designated as low density residential. So if you look at your map for that kind of medium yellow color, it means low density residential. So if you're in that, okay, so we got another that didn't get them. So we're on top of it. We'll send that stuff to you guys. I think David said he'll send it out as soon as he can. So if you're in an area that says low density residential, then you can go to your cards or your descriptions that y'all were sent. And that first paragraph is going to describe the types of uses that are appropriate. So that's kind of a high level description. Underneath that are some bullets that get more specific. The first bullet, the permitted zoning districts, that tells you that if you want to develop or redevelop your property, these are the zoning districts that would be appropriate. So again, this is not telling you that your use you can't do that anymore. It's just saying that these are the zoning districts that need to be found in this area. So if you're coming forward to do something differently with your property, then if it's not one of these categories, it might not be appropriate for this area. So there's always exceptions. That's what this last bullet's for. It's like IDZs and planned unit developments. Those things are different. But in general, these are the zoning districts that would be allowed in that area. There's also information about typical density ranges. That's also a good guide for future developments. You'll know, like for low density residential, it says typical densities in this land use category range from 3 to 12 dwelling units per acre. So that just means that for every acre of land, about 3 houses per acre, or up to 12 dwelling units per acre. So that could be like anything from patio homes to duplexes or something like that. So, but you'd have to check that density against the permitted zoning districts and see if what you're trying to build falls within one of those zoning districts. So that's kind of how this works. As I mentioned earlier, it's a guide for developers as much as it is a decision-making guide for the officials for the city. So that type of information is provided for every single one of these categories: a general description, the list of permitted zoning districts, typical density ranges, and then any other pertinent information that may be helpful. And these descriptions were adopted. If you go back to the city's code, these are the codified land use categories for the city. On the planning department's website, I think you can get to these as well if you need that information. Okay, next slide. Before I move, any questions about that before we move on? We're going to talk more about categories in a second. So, okay, great. This is where we're at now. Again, I'm using just the Brooks maps because they've already been adopted. We're going to be talking about a draft future land use map today. It was computer generated. We'll talk more about that in a second. So that's where we're at right now. The creation of the land use plan, it's an iterative process, meaning that the map you see today is the starting point. We'll be making changes and modifications to that map based on feedback that we get from you guys as the planning team, and also from public feedback we get through the community meetings and other opportunities for engagement. So as we receive feedback and input and talk through some of the challenges, we'll be making revisions to that future land use map. And then as we do that, we're always going to be checking that back against the vision and goal statements for this plan area, as well as the overarching vision, goals, and priorities of SA Tomorrow, like those housing targets and the jobs targets and things like that. So there's checkpoints and feedback mechanisms in place to kind of help guide this. So we go from where we're at today with the map we have today, ultimately to the final map, which will ultimately be adopted and then implemented for this area. Okay, next slide. So we want to take a little bit of time to talk about how the map was for this area was created. I mentioned earlier that it was a computer-generated map, and that just means that we're all designers. We love to do this stuff, and it would be really fun to sit down and just design your area, but that's completely inappropriate. So we did not do that. We put some inputs in, and we got a map to start a discussion. As I mentioned before, over the past, I'd say 50, 60 years, incrementally, some smaller plans have been developed throughout the city. In the top left corner, that's what that map shows, is land use assignments based on previously adopted plans. And for this area of town, almost a lot of your area, not the entire area, but a lot of the area has plans already in place that kind of govern uses, land use. So anything that's colored on that map in the top left, that just means that for those areas there was or there is a previously adopted plan in place. And so we took the land use designations in that previously adopted plan and translated them to the vernacular of those new land use categories. You'll see certain parts of it that aren't colored in, that are kind of grayed out. And that just means that those areas did not have any plan already in place. In the bottom, let's look at on the bottom where it says SA corridors land use, about, gosh, 5 or 10 years ago, somewhere around there, the city embarked on its first attempt at some citywide land use planning, and it was done through a project called SA Corridors. And they identified key corridors throughout the city and did some preliminary land use planning just to ensure that as they were doing long-range transportation planning, that that land use was supportive of that, and that they were looking at land uses along those key corridors that would be most appropriate. So again, just like in the top left, you'll notice with that SA corridors map, not all of this plan area was included in that. And so when the SA corridors plan was done, we took the land use designations from that and also translated that into the vernacular of these new land use categories. And we ended up with that map in the bottom left. And then finally, finally, where it says current zoning, virtually, there's exceptions to this, but for the most part, throughout the entire city, every property in the city is zoned under some way, shape, or form. And so we also, for all these properties in this plan area, did a translation of the current zoning to the future land use categories. So that map that says current zoning is a representation of land use assignment based on the current zoning of the properties in the area. And so those are 3 different ways that we could look at to get some context for land use based on previous planning efforts and on existing rights of use for the properties in this area. So then what we did is we integrated all 3 of those. Those were our 3 inputs that we used to produce this preliminary map that is kind of our starting point for discussion today. And so how we ranked these, and some have precedence over others. So it's a rules-based assignment, and so we set rules for how these would be integrated. Any place that had a previously adopted plan, that took precedence over everything else. And so these areas that are colored in the top left, they were just directly translated into the new map on the right, far right side of the screen. If there was an area that did not have any previously adopted plan in place, then we looked to the SA corridors land use plan to make a determination. And if there was any part of the map where there was neither a previously adopted smaller plan or part of SA corridors in place, then we looked at the current zoning. So that was kind of the prioritization of inputs as we built this preliminary map. And so by putting these 3 together and synthesizing them in the way I just described, we ended up with the preliminary land use map you see on the right-hand side of your screen. So we're going to be looking at this in greater detail in a minute, but let's go ahead and talk about categories next before we do that. I think we can skip over the next 3 slides, kind of just talked about them all. There we go. And I think, Ellie, are you going to do those categories for everybody?
Yep, I will. Thanks, Carissa.
Okay.
Hey everyone, Ellie Schaefer here with MIG. So I'm going to run through the land use categories, all 18 of them, make sure we're all understanding what they are and the differences. As Carissa mentioned, David emailed out these PDF of all these to everybody before, and I think anyone who didn't get it hopefully now have a copy. So if you want to flip through them and read them as I go through, you're welcome to. They just look like a bunch of crayons. It's kind of the graphic style that we're using with them for now. So, so there's 18 land use categories. As Carissa mentioned, City Council adopted these back in 2018. So these are really intended to support the vision of the comprehensive plan and be used as a tool to help us accommodate growth that's projected for San Antonio in a way that aligns with the comp plan goals and is sustainable in its pattern, avoiding sprawl, avoiding negative environmental impacts, and just making sure San Antonio grows in a way that really makes great places and centers across the city. So the 18 categories, we have them here grouped into sort of 5 boxes, if you will. The first box is going to be residential in yellow here. So I'll go through each of these a little bit closer, but in residential, we've got 5 different categories. These just vary in density of how many homes are in an area. Then commercial is the red and the pink crayons. So those are where people shop, work, eat, etc. Those vary also in density as well as just sort of intensity of use. Then in purple, we've got mixed use. So these are places where living, working, playing, shopping is all kind of co-located right in one area, sometimes in one building. Our 5 mixed use categories, 3 of them are kind of based on level of activity and intensity, and then 2 of them are more employment focused. Then industrial, so these are, where things are made, produced, stored, mined, etc. We've got heavy and light industrial as well as agricultural, which we consider an industrial use. And then lastly is civic. So this is anything typically publicly owned, city, state, federal government, parks and open spaces. So to zoom in a little bit about what each of these are, to differentiate them from each other, we'll start with residential. So I'll just point out that the lighter the color of the crayon within its color family, the least intense or the least dense it is. So intensity and density goes up with darkness in the crayon color. So starting with our lightest yellow residential estate, this is the one with single family detached homes. They're typically on large lots, estate sized lots, so lots of space in between the buildings and not too many other uses besides potentially some conservation out in these areas. Then moving up to low density residentials, this is the medium yellow on my slide. This is sort of your more typical lot size, so more what you would expect in a suburban or a medium scale residential area. So it's still primarily single family or single unit detached homes. Then moving up to urban low density residential, so that's sort of the peach color on the bottom of the slide. Here you may still have some single unit detached homes, but they're often a bit smaller in size and on smaller lots, so they're a little bit closer together. We also start to get some more duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, that sort of attached single family unit in urban low density residential. So then moving up to the next 2 for residential still, the lighter orange is medium density residential. So here we still have some duplex, triplex, fourplex type products, but we're also starting to see more apartments. So you get into garden style or smaller apartment buildings in this medium density residential category. And then lastly, high density residential, the dark orange. So this is the most dense residential category. It's primarily going to be apartments and condos, taller, larger buildings to accommodate that multifamily style residential. So now on to mixed use. So like I said, mixed use is where living, working, shopping, all of that is sort of co-located in one area. So not necessarily commercial uses next to a neighborhood, but rather really integrated all together. So you can see in these examples, a lot of these mixed use places will have what we call vertical mixed use, which is maybe a restaurant or a shop or an office on the ground floor with residential uses above or office uses above. So the three categories of mixed use we have here, the first one, the lightest purple, is neighborhood. So that's going to be the smallest scale, smallest buildings. It's really meant to serve the adjacent neighborhood, but be really walkable and provide a mix of uses in one place. Then urban mixed use. So this, we've still got the same mix of uses, housing, employment, retail, etc. These are a little bit higher density, sort of the middle ground, maybe larger building footprints than neighborhood. And lastly, regional mixed use. So we see this a lot in the city's regional centers. So a good example of this is the Pearl, but this is really those super, unique, memorable places, a lot of activity going on all the time, a lot of different uses as well. So the last two mixed use categories are more employment focused. The first one, this sort of light teal color, employment flex mixed use. This has smaller scale, more urban form of office and retail uses. There could be a little bit of a live work setup, but typically it's primarily going to be employment uses. So that may be stacked together in the same building, on a typical street network. The difference between this one and then business innovation mixed use on the right, the darker blue, business innovation mixed use, I think of it as a little bit more of like a campus or an area with larger buildings. So here you might start to get into more like institutional uses, research, maybe a medical campus, tech companies that need a bigger building, that sort of thing. So really it's kind of a scale and development pattern difference between these two. Then commercial. So these three are similar to mixed use in sort of the three categories. So starting with neighborhood commercial, these are small scale retail or office uses. So kind of like you can see in the photo here, it's smaller footprint buildings and often can be like smaller businesses due to that. Community commercial is sort of the middle ground commercial in terms of density. So here we start to get some bigger stores, so maybe some more chains coming in, maybe a grocery store, that sort of thing that just has a bigger footprint. And then regional commercial, so this would be drawing from a larger area, maybe the surrounding community or adjacent communities, has things often like some bigger entertainment uses that are drawing in people from farther away, maybe a movie theater, or maybe some big box stores like a home improvement center or hotels. So again, the difference between the commercial uses and the mixed use is primarily residential. So mixed use is going to have residential in addition to commercial, and our commercial uses just have retail, commercial, office within them. So industrial, here we've got two initial categories. First is light industrial in the light purple. So this is typically indoor industrial uses. Maybe there's some outdoor storage going on, but it's things like, warehousing is a common use, food production, furniture wholesalers. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of retail in a light industrial setting if goods are being sold directly from a storage or production facility. Heavy industrial we think of as primarily outdoor industrial uses. These are more intense, not compatible with or next to residential. So this is more like heavy manufacturing and chemical storage and that sort of more intense industrial use. And then lastly, we've got city, state, federal government. So this is the bluish color. This is any land that's publicly owned, whether it's local city owned, state, federal property. Of course, a good example here would be military base is going to have that city, state, federal government designation. Parks and open space. So of course, public parks, as well as, conservation areas, greenways, that type of thing, and other recreation areas. And then lastly, agricultural. So this one's pretty straightforward, but anything with crops, other types of agriculture, ranching, agribusiness, all of that is part of our agricultural land use, and that does often include some amount of single-family residential as well. All right, so with that, we're going to switch to our mural activity. I'll pause though. Does anyone have any questions about the land uses themselves, what the differences are? I want to revisit any of them before we switch over to our mural board. Feel free to speak up or put anything in the chat, and if not, we can just keep going. All right, let's switch and share. All right, so this is just our digital whiteboard, which we'll be using to collect notes in your feedback. So our first question is really not based on the map. We know you haven't gotten a good look at it yet, but rather, based on the explanation I just gave of the land use cards, and if you've had a chance to read them ahead of time, just based on your understanding of the land uses, we want to know what land use within the Fort Sam area do you spend most of your time in. So maybe you live in the area, or you work in the area, or you spend your time doing something else. Excuse me. We're asking everyone to provide one land use that they spend most of their time in within the Fort Sam area. So you can either put these in the chat, or you can unmute and provide it. Or if you have a printed copy, you can hold it up in front of your camera. But we'd love for everybody to choose one land use that you spend most of your time in. Anybody want to start us off?
We have such a quiet crowd today. Well, I visit Thai House pretty frequently.
Oh yeah.
So that would be neighborhood commercial.
Okay. Thank you, Tanner.
I will go ditto because my relationship to the area is mostly food. So yes.
Great. Does anybody live or work in the area? We can also help you figure out what land use it might be.
Lindsay just commented neighborhood commercial.
3 of those. Anybody willing to share if they live or work?
Any residents? I don't want to call anyone out, but I know there are some residents on here.
Oh,
So Tim said he visits the AT&T Center a lot.
okay. That I would say is probably regional commercial, most likely.
Yeah, I think that arena type uses. And then we have also a light industrial.
And Lugalia, I don't know your first name, sorry, said all that have been mentioned. Do you want to try and tell us which one maybe you spend the most time in of all of the above? Oh, light industrial. Oh, she said light. Okay, there we go. Got it. All right, so looks like we're primarily spending our time in the commercial areas, a little bit of light industrial in Fort Sam.
And as we continue the discussion, everyone can feel free to participate via chat. So I know we have a couple of other members who haven't been able to add their responses quite yet. Maybe they're looking at their cards and they're thinking, you know, really deeply about what category fits them the most. So feel free to utilize the chat or raise your hand at any point during the discussion. We can come back to this.
Yeah, great. All right, so that's just to kind of get you thinking about, you know, how the land uses apply to you, how you're connected with these land uses already in your area. Our next question, I'll hand it off to Carissa. We really want to ask you, you know, in general, and then we're going to look at the map more closely, but in general, what would you like to see more of in the area? And then what may not be appropriate or what do you not need more of in Fort Sam? Chris?
Okay. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So can we make the categories a little bigger? I'm so sorry. I always say that. I feel like I must be vision impaired. Okay, so as we're going through this, also just a reminder to everyone, if I know you guys did this on the first one, so it's perfect, but if you don't know what type of use, thanks, Tim, something like 18th Center falls under, just like you did with that, just say it. Just say like, what would 18th Center be considered? And we'll try to do some of that for translation. These questions are just meant to get everybody thinking in terms of these new categories. Because when it becomes time to look at the map, it's just easier to digest it if you're already kind of familiar with the categories. Another tip as we're looking at these, Ellie showed you this, but you'll notice that all of the different general uses are grouped into color groups. So if you can't remember the names, just remember that the lighter the color, the lower the density. The darker the color, the higher the density. And so if you don't remember the name and we're looking at these, just dark purple is regional mixed use, which means highest intensity mixed use. Light purple is neighborhood mixed use, meaning lowest. So until you get the names, you know, and the differences between them down, just remember light color is the lowest intensity and dark is the highest intensity. Another thing to clarify, the way that our cities grow, cities are organic, they're always changing, but in general, traditionally we've had commercial areas along our major corridors, like along W.W. White, you're gonna have all your commercial, and then you'd have neighborhoods behind them. So that's kind of in the last 50, 60 years, since everybody got car dependent 50, 60 years ago, that's kind of how things were developed. And so if you live in a neighborhood, but you're right next to some retail area, then you live in a residential area, but you're next to a commercial area. When we use the word mixed use, we mean typically the whole area is a mixture. It's not like a neighborhood with commercial next to it. It's like loft apartments above a store, or a project with multiple different kinds of uses in that same project designation, or a block where you have a mixture of townhouses and offices and restaurants and all of that in the same area. So before about 60 years ago, most things were more mixed use. But then we took a flip to where everything got real orderly and separated out. So just to kind of give you some guides to it as we're looking at what these all mean. Thank y'all so much for the feedback. Okay, this is wonderful. So before I start asking y'all more questions, just as a typical guide, this is, and a reminder, this is a regional center for the city. And as Kristen shared earlier, that means that we are trying to hit certain employment targets for this area. And this area, from percent of land designation, the majority of the land in this area is going to be some type of either government, like military or industrial. There's just a lot of military and industry in this area. So we can't just ignore that moving forward. So what we're going to have to talk about for the Fort Sam area is appropriateness, what we need more of, and then where can that be accommodated. So that's why we're asking you these questions like, what do you want to see more of and what's not appropriate? Because we've got to figure out how do we meet those targets in a way that's contextually appropriate. So that's the reason for these questions. Okay, so let's go through and see what you've got given us so far. It seems like everybody likes the idea of mixed use, yay! And more high density residential and regional commercial. Wonderful. That is, you guys get an A+, because that is great for this area. There are very few uses that are going to be inappropriate for any area because, as I mentioned before, it's not about yes or no, do they belong here, but where should they go? There may be some uses that aren't appropriate, but most of these, it's like putting a puzzle together to figure out where in this area is that use most appropriate. But there are times where there may be some uses that really aren't appropriate anywhere in the area. So if we can't figure out a place for them to go, they probably don't belong there. Let's look at the list you've gotten together so far. Wait, hold on. Oh, okay. Thanks, Tim. So we've got all scales of mixed use, which is great. Agree with that. That's because the other advantage of mixed use designations on the map is that they afford a higher level of flexibility for future growth. The mixed use categories have the longest list of permissible zoning districts that are allowed in them. So when you want to position a property for reuse or redevelopment, the mixed use categories give the highest level of flexibility. I will say this though, there are certain parts of this plan area where residential development might not be appropriate. And so in those areas, traditional mixed use, the purple mixed uses may not be good for those areas. So we'll have, when we get into the map, we'll talk about that more. And I know Ellie covered this, but business innovation mixed use and employment flex mixed use are mixed use categories that are more in line or more suitable for industrial areas. So when we were developing this list of land use categories, we were kind of thinking through all of the different combinations and where they would be appropriate and how to facilitate desirable development in the future. And that's how the city ended up with employment flex and business innovation mixed use. So business innovation is typically for larger scale development projects, like if you have R&D, research and development facilities, or in the med center area where there's some laboratories and hospitals and commercial and a bunch of different things like that that are complementary to each other. They don't conflict, but they don't fall neatly or cleanly in any one land use category. So that would be business innovation mixed use. It's campus size, so they're going to be bigger pieces with a mixture of typically non-residential uses. So like that wouldn't be completely inappropriate next to industry. And then employment flex mixed use is was created in an attempt to stimulate adaptive reuse and redevelopment of older, smaller parcels, small scale industrial oriented uses, like more in the areas near downtown, things that might be like 100 years old but are just not being used anymore. I think on another call we talked about the, oh, I just lost the name and I love going down there all the time. Down by the Pioneer Baking area, Southtown. Is it Blue Star?
Blue Star, yes.
Yes. Something smaller like that, you know, where the parcels are smaller, and it's a way to re-envision and reimagine older industrial areas. So that's the intent of the employment flex mixed use. So those are two categories that would be mixed use categories that are a little more appropriate and nearer to industry than some of the others. Okay, let's see what we got. So we've got the traditional mixed use, conventional mixed use, which means a residential component and then a commercial component. Then we've got employment flex mixed use, which I just talked about, and then regional commercial, high density residential, parks open space, and neighborhood commercial. Anybody have any other thoughts about what you want to see more of in this area? Okay. Let's go to the next column over. Notice there's two questions in the next column because they're slightly different. The first one is what land uses are not appropriate at all in this area? In other words, which ones would cause problems? And then the bottom question is just, are there any categories where they're not bad. It's just you already have enough of them and you don't need any more. So something that is maybe good for the area, but you've just already got a lot of it. So you don't need more. So let's look at that first one. Are there any land uses left above? So, you know, we've already kind of filed away the ones that are in the bottom left. So of the categories left at the top, are any of those just completely inappropriate? There's nowhere in this area that they have any business going.
Yeah, I would agree with the person who just put in that comment on light industrial. We're talking about things that we've got enough of, right?
Okay, so you say there's enough industrial?
Yeah, somebody just commented that heavy industrial, light industrial, if that was speaking to things that we already have enough of in this area, I would say so. I would agree with that one.
Okay. And then anything else that y'all think would go in these two, would as an answer for these two questions?
This is Christine. I'm not totally familiar with the residential set of uses, but I would think maybe residential estate. Would that create non-conforming for any type of existing?
I don't think so. I think that would be appropriate because this area is so industry oriented and military oriented that that would not be saying that. I would say maybe we don't need more of it. I don't know. I always hesitate putting anything in that inappropriate category. Because technically, the more diverse your area is, the more sustainable it is and the more stable it is. So that's my name. Just so y'all know, like I named my company based on the principle of mosaic stability, and it's an ecological principle where stable environments have diversity in age, in type, and height, and representation. So that the more diverse our areas are, the more stable they are. And especially because this is a regional center. So for that reason, I just hesitate in these regional centers to say that there's anything that's actually inappropriate. It's just about where it goes on the map.
Yeah, and
with residential,
I want to just chime in real quick. Christine, with the existing residential neighborhoods, I'd say they fall under the category of either low density residential or urban low density residential.
Okay, so
I don't think any of them
go into the estate. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think any of them would fall under that estate category.
And then also I was thinking, and I hate to say you'd ever have enough open space, but in this particular area, would more agriculture be inappropriate only in the sense of if you get more, you have less opportunity for housing options?
Yeah, that's a possibility for this area as well. The only thing that I have we'll talk about this more, like we're not making any permanent commitments here. So just having these down as preliminary feedbacks is helpful, and we can always go back and revisit these later.
Okay.
Okay, we got a comment that enough community. Yeah, so I think that's because you're right about that principle. This area is bound by Kirby to the north, and then you have other areas around it. So it's pretty developed already. And there's a lot of industrial growth in this area. Like most of the new development has been that, which is good because part of the city's objectives is recruitment, you know. So I think you're right. That kind of doesn't really go in line with large scale agricultural and estate scale residential. I think you're right about that. Okay, we got community commercial as a thing. Okay, now that's a good point. So Michelle, I'm glad you said it that way. That is another thing, just so y'all know, sometimes land use maps alone are really not very helpful. If we say this is supposed to be a policy and decision-making tool, if all we provide is a map, that doesn't really help much. So the land use plan is going to be the map, but it's supported by text. So recommendations and descriptions of what is and is not appropriate. So things like that comment you made about how traditional strip mall development is not appropriate, those would go into the text narrative. So giving us feedback like that is wonderful, because it tells us kind of how to interpret the colors and the nuances of what does and doesn't need to go in an area. So thank you for saying that. And
So
you know, the
down
way
the
to avoid
road-
that. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say down the road, if we said something to the effect of preferred parking in the rear, then if you had community commercial, but the parking was in the rear, it would tend to hopefully eliminate some of that strip center.
Something like that. Yeah, we could do that. I'll tell you the best way to avoid that is by aggregation. So every time you get strip development if you strip out your corridors. And that is as much the city's fault historically as it is anybody else's. So as I said before, when kind of in the first generation zoning, if you will, around the 50s and 60s, there became this trend to just all the corridors became red and then everything behind it became yellow. And so if I'm a developer and I go in and I'm trying to figure out what to put there, well, the city just told me. And so I think the cities are just as responsible for that strip pattern as the development community is. And so the way to avoid that is by aggregating, by the creation of centers, which are nodes, and those centers become value reference points for land value and all kinds of other stuff in our communities. It's the reason the Pearl is so successful. There's an aggregation of uses that creates a place. And so when you aggregate uses together, you make a place, and that value is much more stable. Our strip malls are negative because they have like a 20-year lifespan instead of a 100-year lifespan. And you look at our special districts, they have a longer lifespan than strip malls do. The value just by nature keeps depreciating and going and down and down. So this land use map will do a lot to fix that if we can create patterns that reinforce and define places in our communities. That does a lot to help that.
Yeah, and we can help define those places. That's the purpose of the focus area exhibit as well, to identify important corridors, to aggregate what Krista was talking about, and then also the focus areas. Some of those locations are areas where we can aggregate different uses to help with placemaking.
Oh, I love that comment about the live-in business loft. Yes, yes, and yes. That would be like if there's a single standing building with like lofts above that, that could either be depending on where it is, it could either be considered neighborhood mixed use or urban mixed use. When we're doing our land use assignments, remember, we're going to make them based on what could be, what we want to allow in an area. And so, like, for example, if it's right across from AT&T Center, even though right now it might be like a freestanding store with one loft above it, we may want to go ahead and say urban mixed use or regional mixed use because we want to allow a higher level of intensity along those streets. But your question, yes, that would be an example of probably neighborhood mixed use, maybe urban mixed use, depending on, you know, how many loft apartments we're talking about. But that expression is just so wonderful, and it's such a good complement to the surrounding neighborhoods. Any other thoughts on this idea of what we're missing, what we need more of, what we already have enough of? Any other comments about this before we start looking at the map? Okay, let's switch over and let's zoom out so we can see just the colored map on the left. Awesome. Okay. And maybe can we get it to where we can get the legend as a cheat? Sorry. I'm not sure if we can go back. Yes, boom, there we go. So just so y'all know, bear with us a little bit. We tried to do the map to make it slightly transparent so you can see a little bit of the buildings behind the colors to help to figure out where we're at in certain parts of the map. But because of that, the colors got a little lighter than they may have been some other way. So I might have to get some clarification as we go through about what certain colors mean. So, so this will be a group team collaborative on a lot of this. But I just wanted to walk through the map briefly to explain and talk about trends in certain areas. And then after I do that, we are going to look at land use patterns for each of those focus areas. I am seeing that we are running short on time, aren't we? Yeah. Is it 4:30? Is that the real time?
We've got 30.
And we have a hard, yeah, so we have a hard stop at 5, right?
5
uh,
till.
Yeah, a couple minutes before.
Okay. So just so everyone knows, we need to reserve about 5 minutes at the end of the call to just talk through some logistics of next steps and upcoming meetings. So we've got about 20-ish minutes left. I don't know if we'll have time to go through all the focus areas, but there are certain parts of the map that I do feel are important for us to talk about today. But just so everyone knows, this is not the last time we're going to be talking about land use. This is our very first land use discussion. At the next planning team meeting, which is planning team 4, it's going to be a deeper dive into housing and jobs. And again, this regional center is a big jobs employment area. So that'll be a big point of discussion for PT4. And then your planning team meeting number 5, we're going to come back to the map. So we'll come back to this map again over the next few meetings. So again, this is an introduction to the map, give you something to think about, get our categories straight in our heads, and start looking at certain areas. So if we do run out of time today, it's not the end of the world. We knew we weren't going to get to all of this today. This is a very complicated area. So I just wanted to let you know that. Okay, maybe let's start at the south. Let's start down around AT&T Center. So in and around AT&T Center, we have, just to clarify, if any property is owned by a city, state, or federal government entity, it's going to be designated city, state, federal government. So like the military base is obviously government. Any city properties are going to show up as government. Post offices will show up as government. So, and again, these colors are transparent. So Ellie and Kristen, you might need to help me if I missay some things. But along Houston Street is one of the key corridors flagged by the city because of it's a key transit route. And Christine, jump in on top of this if I'm saying something that you want to expand on. But because it's a key transit route, a general policy or principle that we're trying to apply through some of these other plan areas is to do mixed use designations along East Houston Street. Sometimes that might be urban mixed use. It might possibly be regional mixed use, but for the most part, it would be urban mixed use along East Houston. Christine, is that kind of consistent with what you're seeing with some of these other areas?
Yes, absolutely. And I would just say the regional mixed use, that's going to be, fairly intense. So we probably want to think twice before assigning that, but at minimum, urban mixed use.
Okay. And then someone mentioned loft apartments a couple of chat comments ago. Things like that are perfect for this area. Anything where you have retail with a few apartments above, so maybe 2 to 3 stories, not super intense, but those types of mixed use environments provide a really good transition between neighborhoods, which are typically single family or duplex or townhouses, with larger scale developments and activities like the AT&T Center. Chan or David, I don't know if you guys want to talk about any, I don't know if there's any other plans or priorities for the actual AT&T Center Parkway that we need to, is there anything that would influence the land use designations along there?
Not that I know of currently, but we can always revisit that. More recently, council had approved some corridor studies, but that did not include the AT&T Center Parkway.
Okay, let's go up slightly on the map to where the AT&T Center Parkway intersects with I-35.
And just real quick, Carissa, Michelle commented urban or neighborhood mixed use along Houston. So I don't know if you want to adjust that real quick.
Oh, sorry, thank you. And generally urban, we're trying to keep, again, because the land use plan is about relationships and patterns and transitions. And I talked about, aggregation of things that complement each other. If we definitely won't make it a polka dotted application, there'd be a general principle where at key intersections should, or key locations that define a higher intensity uses, and then stepping down gradually from that. It'll in general be an urban mixed use where you get closer to high intensity activities, and then we would step down to neighborhood mixed use in areas that are closer to neighborhoods.
Yeah, and that'd be consistent with the approach that we took for the East Side Community Area Plan, which is west of this. So for the East Side Community Area Plan, closer to downtown, Cherry Street, it's regional mixed use along Houston Street, and then more center of the blocks, it's urban mixed use, and then at the intersection of New Braunfels and Houston, it's regional mixed use, and then it scales back to urban mixed use east of New Braunfels Avenue.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go up a little bit to go north to, and get those switch yards right in the middle. No, yeah, right there's perfect. Just to let everyone else know too, one of the reasons development doesn't ever happen randomly. There's reasons why people select sites for certain things. One of the reasons there's so much industry in this area is because of proximity to interstate highways, but also because of rail access. So you'll notice we included the rail lines on your map here, and you just can see tons of switch yards. Switch yards are typically where things can be loaded and offloaded from your railroad lines in your cars. So you just see tons of switch yards in that area. So that's a perfect example of why there's a reason this is industrial in nature. I just had another call earlier. We did earlier today with another group. I was on another call. We were talking about industrial. They were industrial users, not for this project. But we just had a conversation about how there's just inherent conflict a lot of times between residential areas and industrial areas. And so as responsible land use planners, we're trying to avoid those kinds of conflicts. So when we do our map, what we want to see are transitions that are going to be put in place between industrial areas and residential areas. And we don't want to go in and replace industrial areas with residential areas, or even mixed use that allows industrial, because that's ultimately going to create more conflict. It's not going to resolve conflict, it's going to create more. We also, and then in regard to this regional center, the city recruits industries and jobs. We want jobs for the people who live here. So part of the city's recruitment efforts are to bring good industries that we like to town. And so we don't want to cut those off with our land use map. So with one department of the city telling people to come, and then the land use map telling them there's no place for them. And so the regional centers that are more employment oriented like this one, we need to define what would be appropriate industrial development, and that's where that text comes into play. What the good transitions would look like, and how we're going to minimize the conflict between industrial uses and residential areas. So that this area is I'll just tell you, this is a very challenging area, and it's y'all's project area is probably the most diverse of any. And I'm hoping we have enough time to get up around Rittiman. That's a whole other conversation. But for this area down south, just so y'all know, part of our challenge is going to be to minimize and resolve potential conflict. And we want to capitalize on the infrastructure that's in place, namely the switch yards and the interstate access. But we want to protect existing neighborhoods. Like you see that park and open space, those green belts in there. Those buffers, those kinds of buffers are very good. The employment flex mixed use is a wonderful transition between industrial and residential. Commercial uses, certain commercial uses can serve as helpful transitions as well. So I just want to kind of zoom in and show you guys what makes this area particularly challenging and how this map needs to get cleaned up a little bit moving from this point onward.
I've got a question about you brought up the rail yards, and that can be seen as a positive from being able to attract some light industrial, some employers, right? It's such an elephant in the room. Like, what is the long-term plan? How does what UP is how they're utilizing that? What's their long-term plan? Like, that to me is one of the biggest I don't know, challenges, but factors to however you want to develop this area, or however you want to draw and map it out. Like, what are they doing long term? So I think, can put all the different colors on the map, but that's such a big impact.
Yeah, no, huge. And that's where that text will come in, because I think what you're talking about are kind of like, what are the standards for that new development? And just saying something can come in, what's it going to look like? Are there standards in place for these new industries so that they don't bring down the area in whole?
No, it's more about like, what are the knowns? What are the long-term plans with UP, the rail lines, the switch yards? You guys even address that here?
Okay.
Like, it's here, it's going to be here forever. Because we're just coloring around it right now.
Well, I'll just as a reality, and Chan, you can, and David can correct, but in general, they're not always really good about sharing that kind of information. But you can assume that if they're active lines, that unless the city has it flagged for some type of transition, I would assume they're going to stay active. It's very difficult to reclaim railroad right of way. Doesn't mean that particular switch yard is active right now, but if the infrastructure is there, I would just assume that. But I would say I'll flag that, and Shannon, David, we can talk about this kind of offline, but we probably can do a little bit of due diligence to just verify and validate that those are active lines. But if you're going to make any assumptions, just assume that they are, because it's very difficult to reclaim those. Sometimes can, but.
No, I agree with what Krista just said. For another plan area that we were working on prior to this, there was an abandoned railroad easement line for a spur that has not been in use for decades. And we identified it as a potential area for a linear park. And unfortunately, we were not able to make much progress on that. So I think what Krista's statement about just assuming that they're active is correct, especially with this area, the Pan Am Industrial Park area. There's some plats currently being processed for additional warehouse use there or industrial use there. So I think it's safe to assume that they're active right now. And we circled it as focus area to that Pan Am industrial area, but I think when we wanted to discuss this with the planning team, because when you look at the layout with the railroad line, I-35 there, it kind of, based on the existing infrastructure, it kind of serves as a buffer to minimize any potential conflicts already. So it begs the question of, do we even contemplate any other uses, or just have this remain as industrial as it currently is?
And it could be a different type of mixed use. Like I said before, employment flex mixed use, business innovation mixed use is going to allow higher flexibility and more diversity, and those types of designations accommodate higher value, higher quality development generally, visually. Like when we look at something that's more attractive and fits better with a community than just saying heavy industry or light industry. Because you're going to get research and development facilities, lab facilities, things like that are inside, that are more compatible with our commercial environments. So it doesn't mean that we need to make everything here pink. That's not what I'm saying at all. But just want to do that reality check for everyone, because we would be doing a disservice to you guys if we just told you we're going to change all of this and make it all like awesome new mixed use. I mean, it's just probably not going to happen. Now that's not true for the whole planning area, so I don't want to be a Debbie Downer for the whole area. So let's zoom out a little bit on the scale and move to another area that that's not the case for. So once you get outside of like right around Dietrich and that area that has a number 7 there, you'll kind of notice there's still a lot of pink, but it's more light industry. And there's a lot of opportunity for future development in that turquoise area. And the turquoise, again, is employment flex mixed use. So it could be that, or it could be business innovation, or something else if you want to send it that way. But if you look at these areas on Google Maps or anything else, you can just see that there's a lot of industry in these areas. And so if you go encouraging residential development of any kind in there, nobody wants to live next to that. So you're creating an environment that's not good for someone to live in. So we want to be responsible planners and not do that so much. So our challenge is going to be to figure out, okay, so what, if that's surrounded by industry, what are some of our uses that we need in this area that wouldn't create conflict? And that's the way we're going to start thinking about this, is what are that list y'all gave us of things you want to see more of, things you don't want to see more of. We'll pull from that to try to figure out, okay, so what could go around this area? I want to talk about W.W. White a little bit, if that's okay. We're running out of time, so if it's okay with y'all, I'd like to spend the rest of the time talking about W.W. White, about 410, and about Rittiman. I think that those areas are going to be, I'm sorry, 35. W.W. White, 35, and Rittiman will easily eat up the rest of our time. So there's a lot we could talk about with W.W. White, but access is a huge challenge, you know, but historically, this has been a major corridor for this side of town. And y'all, does anyone on this call live in this area? Okay, I'm actually down here a lot because I go to Fanix Nursery like at least, I don't know how many times. So I'm down driving this a lot, and I always get on the wrong road. so I know from personal experience that that wayfinding and navigating that intersection and getting onto W.W. White is quite a challenge. When this roadway was developed, it oh, thank you. Okay, Jackie, great. Oh, okay, awesome. Because the right-of-way for this road is so wide, and there is so much older commercial development along this roadway, there's a lot of opportunity there to be captured, especially down to the very south of your planning area at the intersection with I-10. That area is one, if you notice, there's residential to the west, there's a neighborhood to the west, and you have I-10 frontage down there. So in this area, that's probably that, and the 410 frontage where it curves right there are the parts of this where you have probably some ability to get something in there other than industry, I would say. So as we keep looking at these things, just kind of flag W.W. White in your mind as a potential corridor for adding some stuff in, especially at the intersection with I-10. And that area that has been identified as focus area number 7 as well. Anyone have any comments about the, wait, let me see. Oh yeah, okay. Yes to barbecue, Lord, yes to barbecue. I hope that works. So y'all's input on W.W. White, I'm not sure where that is. Tell me where that is, the land by the post office.
It's on East Houston, down the street from, or across the street from Sam Houston High School.
Okay, okay. Is it pink right now?
Say it again.
Is it pink right now?
Yes, it is pink.
Okay, So there's things like that. If you guys, that's the kind of stuff we need to refine and figure out. And we'll do some of that refining in PT5. But giving us those kinds of questions now, when we regroup and go back to this map, it's kind of like giving us a list of things to look at. So that is helpful. And then also, again, I had a call with an industrial stakeholder group about another thing earlier this morning, but they're a big event, and it's one of my, it's school districts often do site selection for their schools based on the price of land, not based on the suitability of the location. And that has always been a problem. So you'll end up with schools going in industrial areas, and a lot of times it's even elementary schools. And there's nothing the city can do to avoid that, because school districts are political subdivisions of the state. They're not controlled by the city. And so the cities, so we have to take a responsive position to the location of schools, which is really frustrating. So you brought up the school thing. So just to let you know, another challenge that we'll hopefully be able to rectify is how to make our school areas safer by buffering those in land use terms as well. So I'm glad you brought up a school. Okay, let's go up north from space. So I'd like to look at is basically from the 35-410 split north to Rittiman. And then if we have time, also Rittiman Road. So how active is this area as a commercial area still, in y'all's opinion? How active is the commercial activity in this area?
Chris, I just wanted to do a quick time check. I think we have about 2 more minutes of discussion, then we can get to next steps.
Yeah.
So we can wrap up by 4:55.
Okay. Do y'all have any thoughts on that? Especially the Rittiman and 35 intersection.
And I'm sorry, can you repeat what you were asking?
Yes. Any thoughts or comments about commercial activity at the Rittiman and 35 intersection, along Rittiman at 35?
It's quite a lot of commercial activity.
Yes. Okay.
This is Jackie Ali. With the HEB distribution center there, I think that causes a lot of activity with the 18-wheelers in and out.
Yeah. That area, Rittiman has just historically been such a key commercial corridor for this side of town, but it's right up next to so much industry. So we've just been talking internally about how to handle that. There's some old shopping centers just west of 35. I forget the name. It's like Rittiman Plaza, I think is what it's called. And then you have all of the other commercial right there on Rittiman, just east of 35. But then you drop south of that and you're instantly, like you mentioned, the distribution center, you're instantly in industry. So I don't know what, I think that area is really important. So we haven't flagged it as a focus area so far, but it is going to be an area that we pay a lot of attention to as far as cleaning up the land uses. And we'll probably have to look at some mobility challenges as well. Again, look at those switch yards up there. We talked about switch yards down south. You've got a lot more of those up in that area right now too. So how are we doing? Okay, so the only other thing to point out is as we look forward and move forward with these, we are going to try to bring in the uses, the inputs y'all gave us on what's missing, what we want more of, what we don't want more of. And we'll be fiddling with this map and bring you an updated draft, probably, definitely by PT5, and talk maybe briefly about some of this stuff at the next meeting. Okay, so David Chan, y'all want to give us some next steps?
Yeah, I'll cover some next steps. Thank you all again for attending today and participating, providing feedback and input towards us. Really appreciate it. Again, we'll have further opportunities down the road at planning team meeting number 4 and 5, even at the upcoming community meeting to provide further feedback. Well, as Channery mentioned in the comment as well, we're actually working on an interactive engagement activity that we'll be sending out here in the next couple of weeks, where you can provide further feedback as well. But to cover some of the upcoming next meetings that we'll be having is next week, we are having a presentation from our Neighborhood and Housing Services Department, which they are going to be covering the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. So as we go into planning team meeting number 4, where we're going to be looking at land use through economic housing lens, this will be certainly a great meeting to attend to, and we certainly encourage you to attend if you can. That's going to be next Wednesday, August 24th at 6 p.m. That's going to be on Microsoft Teams, so that is a virtual meeting. And then our 4th planning team meeting is slated for Thursday, September 22nd, from 3 to 5 p.m. And then we'll have our 2nd community meeting during the week of November 14th. So we're still working on time and date for that specifically, but tentatively around that time, we'll have our 2nd community meeting, community-wide meeting. And of course, if you have any questions or want us to come to your neighborhood or organization, Channery and I are both happy to come out and provide some further information to you. Again, thank you again for your time today and your comments. We really appreciate it. With that, I'm going to open the floor if anyone has any questions or comments before we head out for the night. Okay, well, thank you all again for your time today. We'll, of course, send up follow-up information regarding this meeting, like the meeting recording, presentation, and whatnot in the coming weeks as well. But otherwise, thank you. Have a great night, and thank you again for your time.
Great,
Bye,
thank
everybody.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.